Imagine an elven king who survived it all. The fall of his father, the war against Sauron, the destruction of kingdoms, and even the departure of his own kind to the west, and yet remained alone, watching over a world that was no longer his. Thranduil, the king of the north, was the lord of an army that the White Council chose to ignore, and the silent guardian of a frontier where evil never ceased to breathe. He saw Elrond retreat, Galadriel disappear, and Gandalf depart. But he stayed. He stayed to watch over what remained, even when no one else believed in Middle-earth anymore. But why was such a powerful king forgotten? What did the Council know and choose to hide? And to what extent was Thranduil's solitude a choice or a punishment? You will discover the truth behind the last elf who closed his eyes and understand why the White Council's greatest mistake wasn't ignoring an army. It was ignoring a heart. Now, before we begin this journey, tell me in the comments, where are you? Watching from, and what time is it where you are? I like to imagine how this story is crossing borders, like old songs that never die. And if this kind of content truly immerses you in the intricacies of Tolkien's universe, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It's quick, but it makes all the difference in keeping alive the flame we share here. Few remember, but in the eternal forests of the north there was a king whose shadow stretched across entire legions of silent archers. His name was Thranduil, the monarch of Mirkwood, lord of the greatest elven army of the Third Age. And yet, when the fate of Middle-earth was decided, he received not even an invitation. No message from Rivendell, no voice from the White Council uttering the name of the one who had contained the darkness for centuries. It is as if someone had deliberately erased his existence from the official records, an omission so calculated that it seems more like a secret than a simple oversight. While the towers of Imladris gleamed under the light of councils, and the wise gathered around maps and runes, the King of the North remained among roots and mists, listening to the whisper of the winds that carried echoes of a war he had not been called to fight. It is impossible not to feel the weight of this injustice. After all, Thranduil was not a distant ruler, nor a reclusive prince. He was a commander who had trained his people for centuries in battles against orcs, giant spiders, and the shadows that emerged from Dol Guldur, the very fortress where evil had been reborn. And paradoxically, he was the only one among the great to live on the edge of the abyss. The White Council, composed of Elrond, Galadriel, Saruman, and Gandalf, presented itself as the center of wisdom, the bastion of the righteous, the guardian of the decisions that would shape the future of the free peoples. But if their wisdom was so vast, why did they ignore the one who knew the enemy best? Was it pride, prejudice, or fear of what Thranduil might reveal about the contradictions within the council itself? Because perhaps the silence surrounding his name was not carelessness, but strategy, a political choice, and ultimately a way to keep power concentrated in the hands of those who believed they knew what was best for everyone. Thranduil was not merely a king, he was an open wound in the conscience of the elves. His blood came from the lineage of Doriath, but destiny molded him among the treetops of Mirkwood, far from the golden courts of the West. He did not believe in councils or flimsy alliances. He believed in the power of what he could see and touch. His authority was born of example, not of rings of power or ancient oaths. And perhaps that is why he became a threat to those who lived surrounded by books and visions. He represented a different kind of power, an earthly, visceral power that needed no one's permission to exist. The accounts say that in the darkest times, Thranduil's legions watched over the borders tirelessly. His archers, shrouded in green and grey cloaks, moved like shadows, their eyes reflecting the cold starlight. They faced creatures known only to other kingdoms through song, and yet When the invitations to the council were sent, no messenger crossed the Anduin northward. No knight from Lorien brought news. Only silence. A silence that echoed louder than any trumpet blast. It's impossible not to feel that there was something personal in this exclusion. Perhaps old. Memories, perhaps inherited resentments. Many said that the elves of the north were different, less refined, more impulsive, descendants of a king who had defied the hierarchy of the Noldor during the War of the Last Alliance. And this is where pride comes into play. For behind the apparent serenity of the elven councils lay deep divisions. Lineages that looked at each other with distrust, memories of past defeats, and above all, the belief that some peoples were more worthy than others to decide the fate of Middle-earth. Imagine the scene. While Elrond and Galadriel discussed strategies by candlelight, Thranduil watched the wind rustle the leaves of his kingdom. He knew something big was about to happen, but no word came. No plea for help. No warning. Even so, he kept his armies alert, like a king who, even when ignored, understands that responsibility is independent of recognition. This is the paradox that makes his story so powerful. Power ignored, loyalty scorned, heroism that needs no witnesses. And perhaps that is the lesson hidden beneath the roots of Mirkwood. True valor does not need applause. The strength that sustains a kingdom is not made of political alliances, but of conviction. Thranduil fought not for glory, but for survival. And in a way, his absence from the White Council represents something greater, proof that not all wise men are heeded, and not all power is born from unity. There is something profoundly human in this story. How many times does history repeat this pattern? Those on the front lines are forgotten, while those who decide in the shadows receive the credit. Power hides behind the appearance of wisdom, and wisdom becomes a disguise for control. Thranduil, the forgotten king of the north, has become the symbol of all those who sustain the world without recognition. And that is precisely why his absence from the council's decisions is not just a mistake. It's a mirror, a reflection of the flaws that still repeat themselves whenever pride speaks louder than truth. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because to understand the silence surrounding Thranduil's name, we must look back to the beginning. The mistake that stained his lineage and caused the council to never trust his blood. A tragedy that began centuries before, when the sound of drums echoed across the fields of Dagorlad, and the fate of the northern elves was sealed forever. There are battles that end when the blood dries on the ground. And there are others that continue, invisible, within the memory of those who survived. The Battle of Dagorlad was one of those. An open scar in time where the pride of a king and the price of disobedience mingled in the red mud of war. There, long before Thranduil became the Lord of Mirkwood, the name of his house was stained by a mistake that would echo for centuries, the mistake of his father, Orifer. The scene was grand and terrifying. At the gates of Mordor, the army of the Last Alliance was forming. Men and elves marched side by side, united by the promise to defeat Sauron once and for all. At the center of the host, Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor, organized his troops with discipline and strategy. But in the northern ranks, where the woodland elves awaited beneath banners of silver leaves, a different mentality reigned. They were not of the same mold as the Noldor or the Sindar. They were warriors of the forests, children of the wind and the earth, accustomed to freedom and action. And their king, Orifer, reflected this same nature, proud, impetuous, and unwilling to accept orders from others. While Gil-galad drew up the attack plans, Orifer saw in each command a reminder of his own independence. To him, obeying another elf, especially a Noldo, was almost an affront. The ancient tensions between the elven lineages still burned like embers beneath the surface of the alliance. Orifer could not bear the thought of fighting under the command of those who carried the arrogant glint of Aman in their eyes. He believed his own troops were sufficient unto themselves, that the children of the forest were as valiant as any crowned lord of the West. So, when the field of Dagolad became a hell of dust, flames, and screams, he made a decision that would change everything. Before the signal to attack was given, Orifer raised his sword and charged forward. No trumpet sound accompanied him, only the savage roar of thousands of Sylvans charging at the enemy. Was it? And courage, yes, but it was also recklessness. They charged without coordination, without cover, facing the full force of Sauron's legions. The sky closed in with arrows, the ground trembled with the troll's footsteps, and the light vanished under the smoke. Within hours, what had begun as an act of bravery had turned into carnage. The Sylvan lines were crushed by the living walls of orcs and beasts. Orifer fell right there, surrounded, pierced by black spears, while his still faithful soldiers died trying to fight their way to him. When the dust of battle settled, 2/3 of his army lay lifeless, and with them vanished the pride of a people who believed they could fight alone. Thranduil was there, young but old enough to understand what pride does to men and elves. He saw his father's body being carried in silence. He saw the empty eyes of the companions who would never return to the north. And in that instant, something inside him broke. Not just the love for his father, but the faith in the idea of unity among the peoples. The inheritance he received was not a throne, but a trauma. The name Orifer became a reminder of what happens when glory speaks louder than reason. The survivors returned north without songs, without banners, without honor. The Noldor, though victorious in the end, never forgot the Sylvans' mistake. In future councils, whenever strategy was discussed, the name Orifer was mentioned as a warning, and in time this distrust extended to his son. Thranduil grew up under the weight of another's error, condemned to bear a guilt that was not his. History shaped him. He learned to distrust alliances, promises, and above all the word union. Deep down he understood a bitter truth. In wars, no one forgives disobedience, even if the intention was courage. To the other Elven kings, the sons of Orifer were too impetuous, too dangerous to trust when the fate of the world was at stake. It was there, in Dagorlad, that the prejudice was born that would later exclude him from the White Council. But there is something deeper in this tragedy. What was lost on that field was not just an army, but a way of thinking. The free spirit of the Sylvans was replaced by prudence, and the forest, once a symbol of hope, came to be remembered as the dwelling place of a wounded, distrustful, and isolated people. Dagorlad taught that pride is a double-edged sword. It cuts down enemies, but also the bearer himself. And Thranduil, the prince who survived, grew up hearing the echoes of this lesson. Behind his cold, distant gaze was a boy who had witnessed the collapse of everything he knew. His father's decisions became murmurs that followed him for centuries. They don't know how to obey. They are unpredictable. They will never align with our plans. Words that would accompany him to the end, determining his political, military, and emotional destiny. Orifer's mistake was not merely military. It was symbolic. It reflected an era in which elves still believed they could overcome evil with courage and willpower, ignoring that true victory required humility and cooperation. And that is precisely where the curse of the Thranduilian begins, the inability to be heard by a world that only trusts those who bow down. But Thranduil, even carrying this shadow, never bowed down. He built a new kingdom and vowed that no child of the forest would die because of the decisions of others. The father's pride transformed into protection for his son. The independence that once destroyed an army became a shield against humiliation. However, the price was high. Distrust, isolation, and a wound that never healed. The Battle of Dagorlad did not end on the battlefield. It continued to live on in Thranduil's memories, shaping every choice, every silence, every distrustful glance towards the Western councils. It was there that the king was born, whom the White Council would choose to ignore, not for lack of power, but because he carried in his blood the memory of pride and loss. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject because to understand why Thranduil shut himself off from the world, it's necessary to understand how this legacy of pain transformed into a philosophy, a way of life based on distrust, protection, and the belief that alliances are just another form of vulnerability. When the dust of war settled on the waterlogged fields of Dagorlad, the silence was more cruel than the sound of swords. Among twisted bodies and burning flags, few returned to tell what they had seen, and among those few walked a young elf with a distant gaze. Thranduil, son of Orifer, heir to a name that no longer signified glory, but tragedy. The long journey back north was made without songs, without speeches of victory. The cold wind sweeping the Anduin seemed to whisper a lament that no one dared answer. The army of the Sylvans, which had departed with thousands, returned reduced to a handful of survivors marked by blood and shame. Orifer was dead, and with him fell the pride of a lineage. The father's mistake spread among the peoples like a troublesome rumor laden with judgment. For the Noldor and the Sindar, the name Orifer had become synonymous with recklessness, a cruel reminder of what happens when courage is mistaken for arrogance. In the councils that followed, the wise repeated in hushed voices, "Never trust the elves of the wood." And this phrase, uttered so many times behind the scenes of alliances, became a sentence that would echo for centuries. Thranduil heard these words more than once, even as a young man, when he passed through the lands of other elven kingdoms. Many greeted him with respect, but behind their gazes there was always the same shadow: distrust. He was the son of error, the heir of the king who had ruined a part of the last alliance. It was as if Orifer's blood carried within it the seed of disobedience, something that could never be fully purified. And it is curious how the collective memory of peoples tends to transform tragedies into burdens that perpetuate themselves. Time does not erase, it only changes the tone of the memory. In the young prince's heart, the weight of this legacy grew like a deep root, intertwining with his personality. He loved his father, but couldn't defend him. He admired his courage, but feared the price it had exacted. Between admiration and resentment, Thranduil learned a bitter lesson. In a world of alliances and betrayals, trust is a luxury that can cost too much. Thus was born the mindset that would shape his entire reign, a mixture of prudence, coldness, and an almost obsessive independence. Upon returning north, Thranduil found a broken but still standing people. The Wood Elves looked upon him as one sees the last pillar of a ruined house. The responsibility fell upon him even before he understood what it meant to rule. He had to lead while still mourning his father. He had to rebuild while carrying guilt that wasn't his. There was something quietly heroic about this journey, something few stories tell. The transformation of a wounded son into a king. Not for glory, but out of necessity. The lands of Mirkwood were brighter, more vibrant, full of light back then. As the centuries passed, and Thranduil built his kingdom in the shadow of the mountain and among the roots of ancient trees, the place seemed to absorb the same feeling as its people, an immense yet hidden beauty. The forest closed in on itself, as if wanting to protect the secrets of those who lived there. It was a living metaphor for Thranduil's own soul, a fortress of elegance and silence, guarding pains that few understood. The elven kingdoms of the West, Lothlorien and Rivendell, watched the isolation of the north with suspicion. Elrond saw in Thranduil a talented but unpredictable leader. Galadriel, with her gaze that spanned ages, perceived that the son of Orifer carried not only wounds, but a dangerous philosophy, the belief that true safety exists only when all doors are closed. For the Noldor, this view was selfishness. For the Sylvans, it was survival. And perhaps they were all right, because history rarely chooses a side without tarnishing the other. What Thranduil learned over the centuries is that loyalty isn't imposed, it's earned. But he also learned that among elves and men, the memory of failure is more enduring than any act of redemption. So, when the White Council began to form, no one thought to call him. And he, out of pride and grief, didn't ask to be included either. It was a vicious cycle. He didn't trust them, and they didn't trust him. This dynamic reveals much more than politics. It reveals the nature of a mind that defends itself too much. The mentality of someone betrayed by their own heritage, who decides to build internal walls to never again feel the same blow. The name Orifer became a wound he swore never to let bleed again. But at the same time, it was impossible to erase what was in his blood. Every time someone called him King of the Dark Forest, there was a distant echo of irony, because deep down, everyone knew that throne was born from defeat. Still, Thranduil transformed that defeat into discipline. He made pain a method. Under his command, the forest elves became silent, precise, and loyal warriors. He never allowed another leadership error, never acted impulsively, never rushed ahead. With every decision, the invisible weight of Dagorlad hung over his shoulders. It was as if he fought every day to prove that the name Orifer could mean something other than shame. But fate has a cruel irony. The more someone tries to escape the shadow that haunts them, the more they resemble it. The isolation that Thranduil imposed on his kingdom, the constant distrust, the refusal to submit to advice, all of this essentially resembled the same pride that had destroyed his father. He tried to correct the inherited mistake, but without realizing it, he was recreating the mentality that spawned him. And it is at this point that his story ceases to be merely political and becomes profoundly human. Because we all, at some level, struggle against what we inherit, trying to be different without realizing how much we repeat the same patterns. The burden of the name weighed upon him like a crown of thorns. Though no one said it aloud, Thranduil knew he would never be fully forgiven for what his father had done, and perhaps deep down he himself had not been able to forgive him either. This mixture of pride and resentment shaped the king the world would know, a beautiful and distant ruler, wise and melancholic, capable of grand gestures and long silences. A king whose greatest war was not fought against orcs or shadows, but against his own heritage. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding Thranduil is understanding how the weight of a name can become a destiny, and how the attempt to escape shame can transform into the most elegant and silent prison of all. Thranduil's kingdom was not born of power, but of necessity. When the echoes of Dagorlad finally fell silent, and the name of Orifer was lost amidst rumors and distrust, the young heir understood that there was no room to trust anyone but himself. He did not inherit a throne, he inherited a trauma. And it was from this trauma that he built a silent empire, hidden beneath ancient roots and songs, a kingdom where the wind spoke through the trees, and where each leaf seemed to hold a secret. There, in the depths of the north, the Mirkwood Forest was born, a place of splendor and solitude, beautiful and impenetrable as the very heart of its king. Thranduil's decision was not born of arrogance, but of survival. After his father's death, he saw how the great councils of the West treated his people with condescension and distrust. The Wood Elves were seen as primitive, impulsive, unworthy of leadership. So he decided to build a kingdom that did not need approval, a dominion sustained only by the will of its inhabitants. The dense forests, the underground halls, the living walls formed by ancient trees, everything reflected a clear philosophy. No king of the West will decide the fate of my people. While other kingdoms sought alliances, Thranduil retreated deeper into isolation. His guards became shadows among the tree trunks. His armies vanished before the enemy could even fire an arrow. Every visitor who entered his borders was received with caution, and every agreement was measured in silence before being accepted. He transformed the forest into a fortress, and the fortress into a mirror of his own soul, beautiful, mysterious, but untouchable. Few understood that behind this apparent coldness lay an ancient wound. Behind the scenes of history, Thranduil observed the mistakes of others with the calm of one who had already learned from pain. He saw the dwarves destroy themselves in wars for gold. He saw men betray promises in the name of power. He even saw the elves themselves divided between pride and exile, and faced with all this, he solidified his decision. Better to be a solitary wall than a fragile bridge. His mentality was one of resistance and self-preservation. Not cowardice, but autonomy. A concept that resonates even today in anyone who has been betrayed and learned to trust only themselves. The dark forest became a symbol of this mentality. Inside, time seemed to move at a different pace. The songs were not of war, but of remembrance. The light filtering through the treetops seemed like echoes of a past that refused to die. It was as if the kingdom itself breathed the trauma of Dagolad, transforming pain into discipline, fear into strategy. No intruder went unnoticed, no shadow entered unguarded. Thranduil built a civilization that flourished in the twilight, and that twilight became its strength. But there was also a price. The distance between the king and the world grew. Ties with Lothlorien weakened. Conversations with Elrond became rare. Even the men of the lake, who depended on trade with the north, felt the invisible barrier separating the realms. Thranduil was not cruel, just inaccessible. His authority emanated from a kind of presence that didn't need shouting. A single look was enough, and everyone understood that the king saw beyond words. It was a leadership built on silent trust, on voluntary, almost spiritual obedience. In his subterranean court, the air was cold, but the atmosphere exuded an almost ethereal beauty. The carved columns resembled petrified tree trunks. The halls echoed with distant voices, reminders of the time when the elves still believed in the brilliance of the stars. Thranduil walked these corridors like a guardian between worlds, half light, half shadow, and though he would never admit it, this balance made him a prisoner of himself. Because the more he protected his people, the further he became from what once motivated him. The desire to belong. Thranduil's isolation was both a shield and a sentence. He believed that the purity of his people depended on distance, that by keeping the world at bay, he would preserve what remained of the ancient light of the elves. However, this very isolation prevented him from seeing how much the world had changed. While evil reorganized itself in Dol Guldur, only a few leagues to the south, the king of the north closed himself off even further in his silence. Perhaps he didn't realize that the forest itself was beginning to reflect this state of mind. The trees had become denser, the shadows longer, and the air heavier. It was as if the entire kingdom absorbed the solitude of its lord. This seemingly rational choice had deep roots in Thranduil's mindset. He had transformed distrust into a form of wisdom. For him, loyalty wasn't bought with alliances, but proven over time. And if time was the judge, then isolation was the verdict. But there was a hidden contradiction. In trying to protect what he loved, he also limited what that love could achieve. Isolation brings security, but it robs growth. It's a truth that transcends Middle-earth, a reflection of human nature itself, when the fear of error outweighs the desire for connection. Over the centuries, Mirkwood ceased to be merely a refuge and became a fortress of silence. Few dared to enter, and even fewer left. Thranduil's name became a mixture of legend and warning. For some, a wise king who knew how to resist corruption. For others, a symbol of pride and detachment. But in both cases, there was an uncomfortable truth. He was the echo of his father's mistake, transformed into philosophy. Dagorlad's wound had healed, but the scar still shaped every decision. And it is at this point that the story gains depth. Because Thranduil's isolation was not merely political, it was emotional, spiritual, almost existential. The king who shut himself off from the world also shut himself off from himself. And while the other kingdoms prepared to face the return of darkness, he believed that silence would be enough to keep evil at bay. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because to understand the true meaning of this isolation, one must look beyond the forest and see what truly grew in the shadows of Dol Guldur right before the gates of his kingdom. When the White Council was formed, the elven flutes played in the halls of Rivendell, and the bells echoed in Lothlorien. It was the herald of a new era of unity among the free peoples of Middle-earth, an assembly of wisdom and power created to stem the advance of darkness. Elrond presided with his serene calm. Galadriel, with her time-piercing gaze, guided the discussions. Gandalf brought the fire of restlessness and hope, while Saruman the White clothed himself in the authority of reason and the mastery of knowledge. And yet an unsettling silence hung over those meetings. The silence of a name not invited to sit among them. Thranduil, the King of the North, lord of the greatest elven army still existing in Middle-earth. His absence was neither accidental nor innocent. When the council was convened, messages were sent only to trusted leaders, as the scroll of Elrond stated. Trusted. That word sounded like a blade when uttered by those who once judged Orifer, Thranduil's father, for his act of pride in Dagorlad. For them, the memory of that disobedience still stained their son's name. The distrust spanned centuries, as if blood carried a silent condemnation. And so, even as the only Elven King to live on the direct borders of darkness, facing the constant threat of Dol Guldur, Thranduil was ignored. For many, this decision seemed logical. The White Council didn't want impetuosity or dissenting voices. It sought predictable figures, capable of maintaining political balance among the peoples, and above all, of obeying without question. Thranduil was the opposite of that. He didn't seek advice. He gave orders. He didn't ask permission. He simply acted. And the council, fearing that his pride would interfere with collective decisions, chose to leave him out. It was a decision that seemed prudent, but which, in time, would prove to be the most costly mistake in the history of the elves. In the halls of his kingdom, Thranduil received the news with apparent coldness, but inwardly he felt the weight of humiliation. It wasn't anger, but something deeper, an ancient echo, the same sound he had heard when he was just a prince, and everyone looked at him as the heir to a mistake. That exclusion rekindled a wound that had never healed. It was as if the council was saying to the world, "The blood of the North is not worthy to decide the fate of the light," and that, for a king who had dedicated his life to protecting the borders of good, was a silent betrayal. The political reasoning behind this choice seemed impeccable. Saruman believed that a centralized council would facilitate control of the resistance forces. Galadriel, while understanding Thranduil's value, knew that his presence could divide opinions. Elrond, ever diplomatic, preferred neutrality. And Gandalf, the only one who truly saw what was lost by leaving him out, lacked the power to contest the decision. Thus, the White Council was born incomplete, strong in appearance, but fragile in essence. While the Great Ones gathered by torchlight in Rivendell, Thranduil watched from afar, in the depths of Mirkwood, the advancing shadows of Dol Guldur. He saw what the Council discussed in theory: the vanishing patrols, the corrupted trees, the animals fleeing from the south. His practical experience made him, paradoxically, wiser than all the scholars who ignored him. He did not study the shadow, he confronted it, and perhaps that was precisely why they preferred to keep him at a distance. A king who knows evil intimately threatens the purity of those who still believe they control it from afar. Behind the scenes, there were also interests that few dared to admit. Saruman feared that Thranduil would challenge his authority. Galadriel, while admiring the strength of the King of the North, recognized that his pragmatic vision could clash with the ideals of the Council. And Elrond, faithful to the tradition of the Noldor, saw in the Sylvans a people of instincts more than of reason. Amidst these tensions disguised as wisdom, the White Council became a reflection of the very weakness it swore to. Combat, the inability to trust. The wound that opened at that moment was not only personal, but symbolic. Thranduil's exclusion revealed the division that gnawed at the hearts of the elves, pride disguised as prudence. In attempting to forge a perfect alliance, the Council forgot that perfection is not synonymous with strength, because true strength is born from difference, from the contrast between visions, from the union between those who think differently. By leaving the most experienced king of the North out of the picture, the Council deprived Middle-earth of the practical wisdom that could have anticipated Sauron's return. And the result of that choice soon became apparent. While the wise men debated theories about the necromancer of Dol Guldur, Thranduil already knew who was behind that mask. He felt Sauron's presence not as an idea, but as a reality. The shadows that crawled along the edges of his kingdom were living proof that the enemy had returned. But how could he warn a council that had never listened to him? How could he convince those who from the beginning considered him unworthy to speak? Thranduil understood then that the exclusion was not merely an insult, it was a revelation. The White Council, in its quest for control and harmony, had become blind to its own purpose. They had gathered to protect Middle-earth, but ended up creating the first imbalance. And that is how great falls begin. Not with wars, but with decisions made in the name of selective trust. The wound of the White Council did not bleed in public, but it pulsed silently in every gesture of the King of the North. He never spoke of it openly, but his isolationist policy was further consolidated after this episode. Pride, once a defense, became a philosophy, and the kingdom already closed became almost impenetrable. What the Council feared, Thranduil's unpredictability, became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding this rejection is to comprehend the point at which the arrogance of the wise men paved the way for the enemy's return. And behind the gates of Dol Guldur, something was beginning to awaken, something that Thranduil sensed, but that the White Council chose to ignore. The wind that blew from the south no longer carried only the damp scent of old leaves. It came laden with something denser, almost metallic, a harbinger of ruin. Dol Guldur, the fortress that grew on the borders of Mirkwood, stood like an open wound in the earth, pulsing with the dark energy of what had once been Sauron. The darkness did not arrive all at once. It seeped in like mist, slow and treacherous, advancing among the roots, contaminating the forest, distorting the birdsong and the brilliance of the stars. And it was precisely there, before the invisible enemy, that Thranduil and his people lived, day after day, between beauty and the abyss. No other kingdom had known evil so intimately as that of the northern elves. While the White Council debated theories and strategies in illuminated halls, Thranduil confronted the shadow with what he had: courage, silence, and discipline. His borders were a living line between what remained of light and what was already becoming despair. The forest, once bright and lush, began to change before his eyes. Millennia-old trees withered as if weeping, rivers once translucent became murky mirrors, and nightmarish creatures began to inhabit places where elven laughter had once been heard. But Thranduil's sons did not flee, they adapted. The king understood that the war he faced was not made of direct battles, but of continuous resistance. Thus were born the tactics that would make his army feared and, at the same time, almost legendary. The elves of the north learned to disappear among the trees, to move without leaving a trace, to attack as if they were part of the forest itself. Their arrows flew silently, their traps closed before the enemy noticed. They became invisible warriors, shadow hunters, a living extension of the nature they protected. The accounts of the few who survived such an attack speak of whispers before death, of golden eyes emerging from among the leaves and disappearing soon after, as if the forest devoured them. It was this combination of discipline and mystery that kept Thranduil's kingdom standing, even in the face of a force that no other people dared to confront so closely. However, this very proximity to evil began to breed distrust. In the courts of the West, rumors began to circulate. It was whispered that Thranduil spent too much time at the gates of darkness, that perhaps the shadow watched him so closely that it had already infiltrated his heart. Suspicion spread quickly. How could a king survive unscathed for so long, alongside Dol Guldur? Some believed that the power of the necromancer, the mysterious lord of the fortress, had already corrupted him. Others said that the forest elves had learned to use some of that darkness to their advantage, a kind of dangerous balance between light and darkness. It was a distorted view, of course, but it made sense to those who had never looked into the eyes of the shadow and resisted, because fighting evil daily requires more than strength. It requires an unwavering mind. And Thranduil, though proud and serene, was also human in his feelings. He felt the fear, the exhaustion, and the loneliness of being the only one to understand the magnitude of a threat. Forced coexistence with the enemy shaped not only his tactics, but his soul. Thranduil learned that courage is not the absence of fear, it is the mastery of it, and that leadership is not built solely on glory, but on silent vigilance. While other kings sought fame on battlefields, he fought silently within his own home against an evil that breathed the same air as his people. It was a war without medals, without hymns, without witnesses. But perhaps for that very reason, it was all the nobler. With each passing year, Dol Guldur grew. Its black towers could be seen from afar, even through the constant mist. The elven guards reported noises coming from underground, muffled drums, ancient chants in forgotten tongues. The trees near the fortress no longer responded to the elves' touch, as if the forest had developed a second consciousness, divided between serving the light and the shadow. Thranduil understood the risk. He knew that the more evil spread, the harder it would be to distinguish it. But there was also something within him that refused to retreat. This forced proximity to evil produced a different kind of wisdom, a bitter and necessary awareness of the limits of purity. Thranduil knew that absolute good is fragile when isolated, and that to resist evil, one must understand it. This truth made him dangerous in the eyes of others. But it was also what kept his people alive. He couldn't afford idealism. He needed results, and that required tough, sometimes unpopular decisions decisions that made him seem cold, but which, in reality, revealed a deep sense of responsibility. Deep down, Thranduil was fighting not only against Sauron, but against the very judgment of those around him. The idea that his proximity to Dol Guldur made him suspect wounded him more than any sword. He, who had sacrificed everything to protect his kingdom, was seen as someone who could be corrupted. It is the burden of every leader who remains close to the abyss. The more he confronts the darkness, the more others believe he has become part of it. But perhaps that is the essence of true courage, to endure doubt, isolation, and distrust without succumbing to resentment. Even without the support of the White Council, Thranduil maintained his firm borders. His kingdom stood where many had fallen, and his forests still breathed. Dark, yes, but alive. He knew that each tree still standing was a victory, and that hope, at that point, was not measured in songs, but in survival. The king, who was once ignored, had become the invisible wall between evil and the world. And while Sauron secretly reborn, Thranduil remained a silent guardian, a king who fought not for glory, but for the simple continuation of life. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because behind this almost supernatural resistance, there was a secret that the council never knew. Something that explained how Thranduil kept his kingdom standing, even surrounded by shadows, and that would forever change how the power of the elves would be understood in Middle-earth. Among the many secrets that shape the destiny of the free peoples, there is one that is rarely told clearly. The true reason that kept Thranduil away from the most important decisions of Middle-earth. For centuries, it was believed that his absence from the White Council was due to pride, a reserved temperament, or the legacy tainted by Orifa's mistake. But the truth, when observed closely, reveals something much deeper, almost supernatural. There was a silent force that defined who could or could not participate in the great decisions of the world, the power of the 3 elven rings. And Thranduil, the king of the greatest elven army of the Third Age, never received one of them. These rings were no mere jewels. They were instruments of power, created to preserve, heal, and protect against the ravages of time. Narya, the Ring of Fire, was given to Gandalf. Vilya, the Ring of Air, was with Elrond, and Nenya, the Ring of Water, with Galadriel. Each conferred not only power, but also a kind of superior perception, a spiritual link between its bearers and the secret flow of magic in Arda. And it was precisely this link that allowed entry into the inner circle of the White Council. It was an unspoken requirement, but understood by all. Only those who carried one of the 3 rings could be considered part of the hidden elite that decided the future of Middle-earth. Thranduil, however, remained outside this chain, not out of incapacity, but out of distrust. The guardians of the rings, especially Galadriel, believed that power should be kept away from those whose lineage had already defied the order of the Noldor. The son of Orifa, with his sylvan pride and independent spirit, was seen as someone difficult to control. And the rings, as is known, were not only tools of preservation, they were also instruments of influence. To bear them meant being bound to an invisible network of decisions and secrets. To the wise men of the West, Thranduil was too strong to be manipulated, and so he was excluded. The exclusion, however, was not merely political, it was mystical. The power of the 3 rings formed a kind of spiritual barrier, an energy field that united its bearers on the same frequency. This communion was what made the White Council so cohesive in appearance, but also what made it vulnerable to uniformity. By keeping Thranduil out, the group ensured harmony among themselves, but lost perspective on the real world, the frontier, the battle, the survival. It was like a council of gods who spoke of fire, but had never felt the heat of the flames. For Thranduil, the fact that he had never been invited to share in this power was not a matter of vanity. It was a wound. He understood that deep down, the council did not see him as an equal. No matter the size of his army, nor his wisdom or experience, without a ring, he would never be considered worthy to sit among the great. The magic that once united the elves had become a form of segregation, and Thranduil saw something perverse in this, the illusion of purity used as an excuse to maintain control. Behind the scenes of history, this mystical exclusion had far deeper consequences than one might imagine. While the ring-bearers kept their realms untouched by time, Rivendell and Lothlorien shone as eternal havens. Mirkwood languished under the shadow of Dol Guldur. Without the power of the rings to protect his borders, Thranduil had to rely solely on the strength and cunning of his people. It was a test of endurance that no other elven kingdom could withstand for so long. But it was also the price of independence. This difference created an invisible chasm between him and the other elven leaders. While Galadriel could slow the decay of Lothlorien with Nenya's magic, and Elrond could preserve the splendor of Rivendell with Vilya, Thranduil watched his forest slowly transform into a realm of shadows. He saw time at work, felt the loss, saw his warriors age, his trees wither, and yet he endured. Without enchantments, without blessings, without the privilege of hidden power. His strength came from what the council feared most, reality. It's curious to see how, within this dynamic, true power is reversed. The ring-bearers, protected in their havens, became dependent on the magic that sustained them, trapped in an illusion of eternity. Thranduil, on the other hand, was forced to evolve. He couldn't stop time, so he learned to fight within it. His mindset changed. He understood that power that comes from outside creates dependence, but power born from loss generates wisdom. This is the transformation that separates leaders who govern by the light from those who learn from the darkness. Still, there was a dark side to this exclusion. Many believed the rings protected the elves from Sauron's corruption, but few realized that this protection also blinded them to the suffering of others. By banishing Thranduil, the wise men not only lost an ally, they lost touch with the reality that evil was building on the edges of the forest. It was because of this blindness that Dol Guldur grew unnoticed for so long. The White Council, in its self-confidence, thought it controlled destiny. But destiny silently was already reorganizing itself in the shadows. Thranduil, without any ring, stood as a bastion between two worlds, the world of elven purity and the world of Sauron's corruption. He knew both sides, but belonged to neither. This made him dangerous, unpredictable, and at the same time profoundly human, because unlike other kings, he did not depend on relics, he depended on his own will. This is the part of the story that few understand. The exclusion that was intended to weaken him ended up making him stronger than all others. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because to understand the true impact of this choice, it is necessary to see what happened afterward, when the gold of Erebor rekindled the ambition of the peoples and the name of Thranduil would once again be remembered, not as the forgotten king, but as the silent judge of a war born of desire. The sound of hooves echoed through the valley like silver thunder. Beneath the mantle of clouds that covered Erebor marched the army of the north, disciplined, silent, imposing. The banners of Mirkwood fluttered in the wind and snow, and at their head, mounted on a golden-horned elk, rode Thranduil. His gaze was firm, cold as the steel of the swords they carried. There was no hesitation, only conviction. To those who saw him approach, he seemed an ancient god descending from the forests, bringing with him the inevitability of justice. But behind that impenetrable countenance lay something more complex than pride, an ancient wound concealed by the mask of duty. the lonely mountain ablaze with rumors. The dragon Smaug was dead, but the void left by his fall revealed something even more dangerous: gold. The riches of Erebor, treasures amassed for centuries, enchanted jewels and metals that reflected the brilliance of the sun itself, had attracted the greed of all peoples. For Thranduil, however, it wasn't a matter of ambition. At least, that's how he convinced himself. He marched, he said, not out of greed, but for retribution. Some of those jewels, especially those known as the White Gems of Lasgallen, had been promised to his people long before Smaug's arrival, and when the dragon took the mountain, the agreement was lost along with the trust. Now, with the monster dead and the vaults accessible again, Thranduil had come to claim what was rightfully his. But there is a chasm between right and compassion. Upon reaching the gates of Erebor, the king found wounded men, desolate dwarves, and a valley devastated by war and fire. Yet, he remained unyielding. The words that echoed from his mouth were like ice. I reclaim what is mine. For many, that moment marked the beginning of the myth of the cold, insensitive, and calculating king. A monarch who placed the value of jewels above the suffering of the people. The White Council, upon learning of the episode, did not forgive. For them, Thranduil had confirmed what they had always suspected, that the blood of the North still carried the pride of the father, the same inability to see beyond one's own honor. But what few understood was the hidden truth behind that decision. Thranduil didn't march merely for wealth. He marched for control. He knew that the gold of Erebor in the wrong hands could reignite chaos. Smaug's death had created a power vacuum, and in that vacuum, ambition sprouted like weeds. Bard, the archer of Esgaroth, clamored for reparations. The dwarves spoke of rebuilding the kingdom beneath the mountain, and rumors of armies from the south spread like wildfire. Thranduil understood what few realized. The gold was not just gold, it was a symbol. Whoever possessed it would control the fate of the northern lands. Even decisions made based on reason can seem cruel in the eyes of the world. When he set up camp before the mountain, surrounding the valley with almost military discipline, many saw only arrogance. The Elven King demanded jewels, while men suffered from cold and hunger. The orderly beauty of his army contrasted sharply with the desperation of the refugees, and this image spread like poison. Thranduil, the protector of the forests, came to be seen as the tyrant who bowed before the glitter of gold. And the most ironic thing is that he knew this, he knew it, and yet he did not back down. There are times when a man's reputation dies not because of the lies told about him, but because of the truths he chooses to hide. Thranduil never explained his motivations, never tried to justify himself, and this silence was interpreted as indifference. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps self-protection. The fact is that from that day on, his image before other peoples was sealed. The wise and reserved king became, in the eyes of Middle-earth, a distant, almost glacial figure. Behind the scenes, however, the situation was far more tense than the account suggested. Thranduil knew that Thorin, the dwarf heir to Erebor, would not give up a single piece of gold. He knew the hearts of dwarves and the weight that greed holds over them. He saw the same gleam in Thorin's eyes that he had once seen in the eyes of his father, Orifer, before the fall of Dagorlad, the gleam of pride disguised as bravery, and perhaps that was what led him to act with such coldness. He did not want to repeat history. He did not want another war precipitated by impulses. He preferred to remain still, firm, observing, even if the world judged him for it. The Battle of the Five Armies erupted like an inevitable thunderclap. When the orc troops descended from the mountains, Thranduil found himself compelled to act. And it was there, in the heat of the chaos, that the true nature of his character was revealed. He could have retreated, protecting only his own people, but he chose to fight alongside men and dwarves. The arrows from the north were the first to cut through the sky, paving the way for the resistance. It was a silent decision, without heroic speeches, without applause, an act of genuine honor, even though no one seemed to see it that way. Even after the victory, the shadow of doubt remained. Rumors became legends. They said the Elven King had marched out of greed, that his heart was of stone, that his promises were as cold as the ice of his lands. And Thranduil, tired of justifying himself, allowed the myth to take hold. Perhaps because deep down he understood that the truth does not change the judgment of those who prefer to believe in the scandal. He chose silence, the same silence that had always accompanied him since the White Council. But it's curious to think that, in the history of peoples, the most misinterpreted acts are often the noblest. Thranduil didn't fight for treasure, but for stability. His coldness was a way of protecting what remained of balance in a world that was falling apart. And although the gold of Erebor rekindled the flame of distrust against him, it was also this episode that consolidated his role as the king who never bowed down. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what happened after the battle changed not only Thranduil's image, but the very course of Middle-earth. When victory revealed a deeper wound, the invisible war between the pride of the elves and the fate of men. The northern forests held secrets that even time dared not touch. There, amidst shadows and filtered light, lived the most disciplined and silent army in Middle-earth, a force trained not to conquer, but to survive. Thranduil's warriors moved like the wind among the trees, saw without being seen, attacked and vanished before the enemy noticed. Each step, each drawn bow, each arrow launched was a dance of precision and instinct. They were the ghosts of the woods, shaped by the darkness of Dol Guldur and the rigidity of a king who knew the value of caution. And yet, when the fate of the world was decided, the White Council did not call them. It is a cruel irony. The greatest elven army of the Third Age kept on the sidelines of the great battles. Thranduil watched from afar as Sauron's forces marched on Gondor, as Rohan rode towards the Pelennor, as the men of the West fought for every inch of light. His archers, lethal among the trees, never crossed the walls of human cities. Their king, who had faced evil closer than any other, remained forgotten, as if his strength were inadequate for the kind of warfare the world valued. The advisors and commanders of the free peoples saw the northern elves as forest warriors, agile but limited. They are good hunters, they said, but they are not suited for stone walls. None of them understood that Thranduil's fighting style was different, not a war of display but of persistence. While men built fortresses, he built silence. While dwarves trusted in iron, he trusted in shadow. And it was precisely this difference in mentality that isolated him. The council did not understand that in invisible battles, strength is not measured in walls, but in patience. The truth is that Thranduil knew of his own strategic inadequacy in the eyes of the other kingdoms. He knew that his army, lethal in the forests, would be massacred in open fields. It was the price of having molded an army for the environment in which he lived, an army that didn't need glory, only efficiency. In his heart, there was a mixture of pride and resignation. He knew the value of his strength, but he also understood its limits, and yet the council's contempt wounded him, because it wasn't just a military matter, it was a matter of recognition. While Gondor sent its heralds and Rohan its trumpets, Mirkwood remained silent. The messages that reached Thranduil spoke of grand wars, of allied armies marching side by side, but none of them requested his presence. No letter, no messenger, no appeal. It was as if the North had been forgotten, as if the Elven King was no longer part of history. And in a way, that was true. Thranduil had become a spectator of his own world, a king trapped on a throne made of roots and memories, watching the war that defined the fate of peoples unfold beyond the borders he had sworn to protect. There is something profoundly human about this silent exile, because deep down, everyone has felt the weight of being underestimated, of offering a skill, a talent, a vision, and seeing it all ignored because it didn't fit others' expectations. Thranduil was the personification of this dilemma, a leader with the right sword, but in the wrong field. He mastered the shadows, but the world wanted the spotlight. He understood war as the art of avoiding destruction, but others sought the glory of scars. While armies clashed in the south, the north remained in constant tension. Elven sentinels watched the borders, the drums of Dol Guldur resounded in the distance, and Thranduil, in his underground hall, listened. The sound of war was distant, but it echoed within him like a reminder. The world still saw him as the king of trees, not as a commander of peoples. And that hurt more than any physical wound, because, silently, he knew that if evil triumphed, it would be in his forests that the last vestiges of light would seek refuge, but no one seemed to see it. There was a tragic irony in that situation. The kingdom that had most resisted the shadows was the least valued by those who claimed to fight for the light. While councils gathered to decide on strategies and alliances, Thranduil was there, fighting a war that never ended, against enemies that were reborn with nightfall. His warriors patrolled the edges of the forest, killing unseen, protecting passages and trails that others didn't even know existed. And perhaps for that reason, the world never knew how much it owed him. For many, Thranduil was an enigma. For others, a symbol of selfishness. But the truth is that he was the purest reflection of what time destroys, silent loyalty, strength that needs not be seen. While the heroes of the South received songs and statues, the King of the North remained anonymous, maintaining the invisible balance that kept Middle-earth standing. His name was remembered coldly, but his decisions shaped destiny. Isolation became his destiny. Thranduil stopped expecting recognition and began to act as if the world itself didn't deserve his sacrifice. His wounded pride became his shield. He learned to find meaning not in applause, but in constancy. That was his true transformation, understanding that a leader's worth is not measured by visibility, but by the silent impact of their choices. And yet, there were times when solitude betrayed him. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, when the wind swept through the underground tunnels and the torches flickered on the stone walls, Thranduil allowed himself to think about what it would be like to be there, marching alongside Elrond, fighting alongside Aragorn, being part of history and not just its forgotten sidelines. But these thoughts soon dissolved, replaced by the conviction that had always guided him. Protecting what is under his care is more important than being remembered for it. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of fate. The king who had the right sword but fought on the wrong field ended up being the invisible guardian of the balance that others took for granted. While the world celebrated visible victories, Thranduil won battles that no one saw. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because behind this apparent resignation, something was about to awaken. A decision that would change the course of history and show that even the forgotten strength of a king can alter the destiny of an entire era. Time, for the elves, was always an endless river. But even rivers can dry up when the silence becomes heavier than eternity itself. Thranduil lived long enough to see the light of the great elven cities fade, to watch the white ships sail westward, carrying with them the last melodies of an era that would never return. He survived war, betrayals, shadows, and solitude. But what time could not destroy, longing finished consuming. The King of the North, he who was once feared, respected, and misunderstood, gradually became a living memory of a world that no longer knew how to recognize its own guardians. While kingdoms fell and men built new cities upon ancient ruins, Thranduil remained. Mirkwood, once the stage for wars and glories, began to quiet, as if breathing in mourning. The trees still whispered his name, but the echoes grew distant. He walked among the subterranean halls the size of a king, but without a court, without advisors, without spiritual heirs. The centuries had taken everything except the burden. The world had changed, and Thranduil stubbornly remained the same, a guardian bound to the past, a survivor of an age that did not know how to die. Those few who had seen him recently described a different look in his eyes. The cold glint of a commander was gone, as was the haughty detachment of a monarch. There was something deeper, more human, a weariness of soul, a weight that not even immortals can bear forever. He looked east and saw the sunrise as one. Observes a memory. He looked west and saw the sea, the silent call that many had already answered, but something kept him there between the forest and the shadows. Perhaps pride, perhaps guilt, or perhaps hope, that stubborn flame that survives even in the ashes of those who swore never to believe again. The White Council had dissolved, its members scattered, and with them the confidence that sustained the free peoples. Elrond withdrew, Galadriel departed, Saruman fell, and Gandalf, the last of the wise, left Middle-earth in silence. Only Thranduil remained. He who had been ignored for not possessing one of the three rings now watched the world continue without their brilliance. The kingdoms of the elves vanished, but his endured. Irony or punishment, fate had made him the last witness to all that was lost. They say that in past ages his voice was hardly heard. He spoke to the trees, and the trees answered in murmurs that only he understood. Sometimes he would sit by the roots and remain silent for hours, as if waiting for an answer that never came. Other times he would walk among the empty halls, touching the stone walls that seemed to pulsate with ancient memories. And in this ritual of remembrance, he lost himself a little more. Thranduil did not fall. He disappeared into his own silence. The most curious thing is that, while the world saw him as a distant figure, within him there still existed faith. A discreet faith, almost imperceptible, but alive. He still believed that Middle-earth could renew itself, even without the elves. That men, with all their errors and ambitions, still carried the spark that once belonged to the firstborn. This belief, so small and silent, was what kept him standing. It was what prevented him from embarking for the West. Perhaps he knew that when he left, nothing would remain of the age of the elves, not even an echo. The humans who came after found traces of their kingdom and told legends of the forgotten king of the forest, a spirit who walked among the trees on pale moonlit nights. Some said he still guarded the borders of the ancient woods. Others swore his soul had merged with the roots, becoming a living part of the forest he loved so much. But among all the versions, one thing remained constant. Thranduil never left. He stayed, not out of fear of the journey, but because his love for Middle-earth was greater than his weariness. There is something profoundly symbolic in this choice. While others sought refuge in the immortal lands, Thranduil chose to remain among mortals. He, the most isolated of kings, ended up being the last guardian of memory. He who carried on his shoulders the weight of all ages, from the splendor of the elves to the awakening of men. And in the end, the silence that surrounded him was not merely solitude, it was reverence. It was the last song of a race that bid farewell in silence, leaving behind not monuments, but lessons. Because the true mistake of the White Council was not ignoring an army. It was ignoring a heart that still believed in Middle-earth. While the wise sought answers in artifacts and counsel, Thranduil found them in what they had forgotten: love for the land itself. the connection to what is alive, to what grows, to what breathes. He knew that light and shadow are inseparable, that evil is born not only from darkness, but also from the indifference of those who call themselves wise. When the north winds ceased and the last song of the elves faded into the air, the forest still remained, and some say that on certain nights it is possible to hear a whisper among the leaves, an ancient, melancholy, almost human voice, repeating the words that the world has forgotten to hear. When wisdom shuts itself up in council and pride hides among trees, evil grows in silence. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding Thranduil's end is understanding what truly happens when an empire of light chooses to remain silent in the face of its own truth, and what remains when even the last guardian chooses to stay and witness the dawn of a world that is no longer his own. You know, if you've made it this far, it's because you carry the same kind of curiosity that drives great stories, that desire to understand what lies behind the names, the myths, and the silences. That's why it's worth sticking around. If this content made you think or brought a new way of seeing the world of Middle-earth, subscribe to the channel. It's the kind of space made for those who like to delve deep into the subtext, the hidden truths, and the decisions that changed the fate of the kingdoms. Take the opportunity to leave a comment saying where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I like to imagine this conversation crossing different places and times, connecting people who, deep down, are looking for the same thing: meaning. And of course, leave a like. Not as an automatic gesture, but as a sign that this journey made sense to you. This greatly helps keep this type of content alive and shows that there is still room for stories told with soul. There's a video over here that complements this topic. Click on it and continue watching, because the story of those who stay until the end is always the one that reveals the most about what comes next.